Good morning. Welcome again to Morning Devotions as we just walk through the Bible together. Our passage today is going to come from the book of Luke chapter 3, though I have to be honest with you, Numbers is over the moon today. Now, yesterday it was tedious, I admit, but today the transition of Moses to Joshua's leadership, how to make the transition, how to endorse a new leader, these are beautiful, incredible truths that each of us need to learn. Psalms and Proverbs are over the moon wonderful. There's some incredible gems back there. But I want to talk to you today about revival. I hear so many people today crying out for revival, and I smile and I wonder if they really know what they're asking for. It's been 20 years since the last great move of God. And my heart cries out for a fresh wind of the Spirit. To see a new generation begin to understand that God is not a social movement, that church is not about going and hanging out with your friends and then going out and getting drunk afterwards, that the church is an encounter with God, that God is alive and that God is real, and that this stuff is not just history lessons. We serve a living God. I want people to see the reality of a living God. But when we begin to talk about revival, we have to understand this preparation that's required. Jesus was first and foremost a revival movement among the Jewish people. But before Jesus began his ministry, God sent John the Baptist. Now, as John was prophesied about in Isaiah, he quotes in Luke chapter 3, "Prepare the way for the Lord, make straight paths for him. Every mountain will be filled in, every mountain and hill will be made low. Crooked paths shall become straight, rough ways smooth, and all mankind will see God's salvation." We talked to you the other day in one of our tweets that the purpose of a forerunner of revival is to turn the hearts of God's people to the wisdom of righteousness. Because as God's people's hearts grow more calloused to sin, and as the Bible teaches us, the church stops being the pillar and support of the truth and instead just fits into the mold of the world and lives compromising lives, I'm sorry, a fresh wind of the Spirit can never come. A fresh move of God, a fresh experience of the presence of God will never come. If we're going to see revival, the first things we will see is the pulpits of God's people begin to change. The pulpits will change. Pastors will stand up and begin to speak against compromise and sin. Pastors will begin to stand up and preach holiness again. Remember the purpose. We taught you the other day in the tweet that John the Baptist was to turn the hearts of God's people to the wisdom of righteousness. Now look at how he did this in Luke chapter 3. He stood in front of the crowds and he preached a baptism of repentance. Not a baptism of I'm okay, you're okay. A baptism of repentance. He rebuked the crowds and said, "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the coming wrath? Produce fruit in keeping with your repentance." Wow. Man, he was challenging people. So the people came to him and said, "What should we do?" And he looked at them in verse 11 and said, "Well, those of you that are blessed, be generous and give to others." He looked at the tax collectors and the soldiers and said, "Stop the stealing, stop the corruption." In other words, hey folks, let's start living right. Of course nobody's perfect, but let's start trying to live right. He turned the hearts of God's people to the wisdom of righteousness. Now, if you and I are going to begin to pray for revival, you and I are going to have to recognize God's houses are going to begin to get a little uncomfortable for compromise and sin. There needs to be strong preaching of holiness again. The message of repentance needs to be restored to the church. I was reading an article the other day in a minister's blog, and he was talking about the new secret-style churches, and he said, they just teach everybody believe and receive. He said they've left the message of repentance out of salvation. Brothers and sisters, repentance needs to be a part of who we are. Repentance and living a holy life, it matters how we live. Now I want to challenge you today. I know nobody's perfect, and everybody's going to sit there and throw stones at me and start blogging me and say, "Pastor Sumrall, judge not lest ye be judged." Well, excuse me, the Bible teaches us we are to judge those in the house of God. That doesn't mean condemn, but it does mean evaluate. And that evaluation, God says judgment begins at the house of God. God starts revival by looking at us, His people. Let me challenge you today. Stop the compromise. Young people come to me and they say, oh, Pastor, we're radical Christians. I said, now define radical for me. Well, we don't fit into the mold that the church wants us to fit in. It's still all right to go to clubs, and we go to dances, and we get drunk, and it's all right, you know, because of grace. We're radical Christians. We're radical. We have a radical faith. And I looked at them and started laughing at them. I said, that's not radical. Paul says in Romans chapter 12, don't conform to the pattern of this world. You're just fitting into the world's box. You're not radicals, you're conformists. And they looked at me as if I'd thrown a bucket of cold water all over them. It's time for a message of holiness to return to God's house.